The Assyrian Empire was one of the most powerful and feared states of the ancient world, dominating the Near East between the 9th and 7th centuries BC. From capitals such as Ashur, Nimrud, and Nineveh, the Assyrians built a vast empire stretching from Egypt to Persia. Their strength rested on a professional standing army, advanced iron weaponry, efficient administration, and an ideology of absolute royal authority. Assyrian kings presented themselves as chosen by the gods to impose order through conquest. Tribute from conquered regions fueled monumental building projects, road networks, and military expansion. At its peak in the 7th century BC, under rulers like Ashur-banipal, the empire appeared unstoppable. However, beneath this power lay extreme centralization, constant warfare, and heavy dependence on coercion. These strengths created long-term weaknesses that would eventually turn Assyria's dominance into vulnerability.
The primary cause of the Assyrian Empire's collapse was severe overextension driven by constant warfare. Assyria's power depended on nearly continuous military campaigns to suppress rebellion, collect tribute, and intimidate rivals. Every year demanded new resources, soldiers, and logistics. As the empire expanded, its borders became longer and harder to defend, stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. Maintaining garrisons across such distances placed enormous strain on manpower and supplies. Conquered populations were ruled through fear rather than integration, ensuring frequent revolts that required brutal suppression. This created a vicious cycle. Rebellion led to more campaigns, which exhausted the state further. Over time, the empire's military system became unsustainable. Instead of stabilizing Assyrian rule, perpetual warfare drained resources, weakened internal resilience, and made the empire increasingly fragile. Relentless warfare also produced severe economic stress within the Assyrian Empire. The state relied heavily on tribute and plunder to finance its army and administration. As resistance increased and campaigns grew more costly, returns diminished. Agricultural regions were repeatedly disrupted by conscription, deportations, and insecurity, reducing productivity. Trade routes suffered as instability spread across the empire. While monumental projects continued in the capitals, the countryside bore increasing burdens. Heavy taxation and forced labor weakened loyalty and reduced economic resilience. The Assyrian economy was designed for conquest, not long-term sustainability. When expansion slowed and resistance hardened, the imperial system struggled to generate sufficient resources. Economic strain weakened the state's ability to maintain armies, reward elites, and respond to crises, deepening structural instability. Economic strain weakened political cohesion at the heart of the Assyrian state. Royal authority depended on constant success in war and steady distribution of rewards to elites, generals, and governors. When resources declined, internal rivalries intensified. Succession disputes became more dangerous as factions competed for power. Provincial officials grew more autonomous, focusing on local survival rather than imperial loyalty. Communication across the empire slowed, and coordination weakened. The highly centralized Assyrian system left little room for flexibility during crisis. Instead of adapting, the state fractured under pressure. Political instability reduced the empire's ability to respond decisively to threats, both internal and external. What had once been a tightly controlled machine began to malfunction, exposing the Assyrian Empire to rapid collapse. By the late 7th century BC, Assyria's weakened political and economic systems left it vulnerable to coordinated external attack. Former subject peoples and rival powers recognized Assyria's declining strength. The empire could no longer suppress multiple threats at once. Military forces were stretched thin, morale declined, and defensive depth was lost.
While invasion would ultimately destroy Assyria, it succeeded only because internal collapse had already occurred. The Assyrian Empire fell not simply because enemies attacked, but because its own system of endless conquest, over-centralization, and coercion had exhausted its capacity to survive. Collapse was the final outcome of long-term structural weakness, not a sudden accident of history. One of the most damaging internal pressures on the Assyrian Empire was the problem of succession and elite instability. Assyrian kings ruled through absolute authority, but this system created vulnerability whenever a strong ruler died. Transitions of power often triggered rivalries among royal family members, generals, and court officials. These struggles diverted attention and resources away from border defense and internal stability. During periods of succession uncertainty, provincial governors acted more independently, weakening central control. The empire depended on constant leadership strength to maintain fear and obedience. When leadership faltered, the system quickly lost cohesion. Succession crises did not cause collapse on their own, but they amplified existing weaknesses created by overextension and economic strain. At critical moments, Assyria lacked unified command, allowing internal disorder to grow while external threats intensified. Another major secondary cause of Assyria's collapse was widespread rebellion among subject peoples. Assyrian rule relied heavily on intimidation, deportation, and harsh punishment rather than long-term integration. While this approach worked during periods of strength, it created deep resentment across the empire. As Assyrian power weakened, revolts erupted simultaneously in multiple regions. Suppressing rebellion required enormous military effort, draining resources already stretched thin. Each revolt further disrupted agriculture, trade, and administration, accelerating internal decay. Instead of stabilizing the empire, repression created a cycle of resistance and retaliation. By the late 7th century BC, Assyria faced more revolts than it could manage. Rebellion did not destroy Assyria alone, but it ensured that the empire collapsed from within, while enemies gathered at its borders. Economic exhaustion increasingly undermined Assyria's ability to sustain imperial life. Continuous warfare required massive investment in soldiers, weapons, logistics, and fortifications. As tribute declined and revolts disrupted production, the empire struggled to finance its military machine. Agricultural regions suffered from repeated conscription and insecurity, reducing output year after year. Trade routes became unreliable as instability spread across the Near East. The Assyrian economy, optimized for expansion, lacked resilience during contraction. Without sufficient surplus, the state could no longer reward elites, fund campaigns, or maintain infrastructure. Economic weakness did not appear suddenly, but accumulated slowly until the system could no longer support itself. By the late 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire was no longer capable of defending itself against coordinated external pressure. Decades of internal exhaustion had weakened the army, drained resources, and fractured political unity. Former subject peoples who had long endured Assyrian domination recognized this vulnerability and began to act together rather than in isolation. Enemies attacked on multiple fronts at the same time, overwhelming Assyrian defensive capacity. The empire's military system, designed for rapid offensive campaigns, struggled to respond to sustained multi-directional threats. Communication between regions broke down, reinforcements arrived too late, and command authority became confused. Key cities fell one by one, not because Assyria lacked courage or tradition, but because its institutions could no longer function effectively. External invasion did not create the collapse. It exploited conditions that already existed. The fall of Assyria was the visible outcome of long-term internal decay, finally reaching a breaking point. The collapse of the Assyrian Empire reveals a clear and powerful historical lesson about how empires fall. Assyria's primary weakness was not a lack of military skill, but an imperial system built entirely around constant conquest, fear, and overextension. Endless warfare exhausted manpower, destabilized the economy, and required extreme centralization that left no room for adaptation. Secondary pressures, rebellion, succession crises, economic strain, and administrative rigidity intensified the damage. When external enemies finally struck, they faced an empire already hollowed out from within. Assyria did not collapse suddenly or mysteriously. It collapsed because its own structure demanded perpetual expansion simply to survive. Once expansion became impossible, the system failed. The Assyrian experience demonstrates that power sustained only through coercion and continuous warfare ultimately creates fragility, not stability. Empires endure not by fear alone, but by balance, resilience, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions.